Well, once again, good morning to everyone. hmm And as we all know, for this quarter, we have been dealing with pretty much dealing with obedience throughout. In this quarter series of lessons, we've been dealing with primarily the concept, if you remember our overall theme, of learning to honor God. So what we're going to do this morning is just kind of breeze through most of these previous lessons as we're about to close this quarter out after next week. But all the lessons have been dealing with learning to honor God. And when we talk about honoring God, we said one of the key ways in which we can honor God is through that of our obedience. Hence, this is why Unit 1, which was composed of 3 lessons, dealt with beginning with obedience. And as you remember, in dealing with learning to honor God, we use as a supporting scripture Proverbs 1:7, which says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but only fools despise wisdom and instructions. But we know that word fear can also be translated in the Hebrew tongue. You could say honoring the Lord. So I did a twist of it by saying the honoring of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but only fools despise wisdom and instructions. But when we dealt with this concept of obedience in these first 3 lessons of Unit 1, we talked about what's a good place to start. And a good place typically to start is that with leadership. Hence, this is why lesson 1 was titled Obedience in Leadership. That lesson, as you recall, dealt with how Moses now was called by God through a burning bush to lead his people out of bondage in Egypt and bring them into the promised land. And we know it was Moses who said, "Who am I to bring these people out? Who am I to lead them into the promised land?" Because Moses was a little reluctant about carrying forth this task. But as you recall, God says, "I shall be with you." And upon hearing those words, Moses then did as the Lord had commanded. He was obedient in leadership and following the Lord. This led us then to our next lesson, which was obedient to remember. If you remember, this lesson dealt with the instituting of the Passover meal, or some would call the Passover festival. And basically, they were called upon to remember each and every year to celebrate this meal. They were called upon each and every year to remember to celebrate it each year, but on the 14th day of Nisan, or some would call it Abi, that they were to celebrate this. Also, they were called upon to remember each and every year on this day how to prepare the meal and how they were to eat the meal. But most importantly, they were called upon to be obedient to remember why they were doing it in the first place. Because the most important thing about these celebrations was what was the reason behind why you were doing it. So that lesson dealt with obedient to remember. Then we moved on to the last and final lesson of Unit 1, which was promise of obedience. This is one now where Moses has given the children of Israel now all God's mandates, all his statutes, all his commandments, all his guiding ways for them. And they said, "We will do these things." Moses then, you could say, asked for the second time, "Will you do these things?" And they said, "Yes, we will do it." Moses then, you remember, wrote out all the commandments and then read them back to the people. And they said, "We will do them." And they sealed it with a sacrificial offering of the shedding that of blood. And that ended Unit 1. But then we moved into Unit number 2, which dealt with the overall theme of obedience in worship. And we know worship deals with also honoring God, which was our overall theme of learning to honor God. But in this first of 6 lessons of Unit 2, we dealt with obedience and respect. That lesson, as you recall, God now had rested upon Mount Sinai. And there was a boundary placed all around the base of the mountain. And God had told the people they need to be obedient and told Moses to tell them not to come beyond that barrier. Because the fear was that the people would come beyond the barrier just so they could look and actually see God. But if they would do this, it said they would surely die. But not only are they called to be obedient, the priests also were called to be obedient and respect God, because even his anointed ones could not come to God unless first they sanctified themselves, which means set apart for a holy purpose. They had to wash themselves. They had to groom in a certain way. They even had to wear special clothing before they would come into the very presence of the God. We talked about how we used to play on words by saying, "Come to God as you are." And we said, you can come to God as you are, but you can't come to him any kind of way. Even his anointed had to come to him in a certain way with obedience and that of respect. Then the second lesson of Unit 2 dealt with obedience in worshiping God and God alone. In this lesson, it concentrated heavily upon the first tables of the law. In the first tables of the law, you have 4 commandments. And as we know, these first 4 deal with your one-on-one relationship with God. The first one was that thou shalt have no other God before me. The second one was that thou shalt not make any graven image and bow down to it. The third one was that thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. And then the fourth one was the holy day, which is the Sabbath day. You shall honor it and keep it, and there was no work to be done on that day. So that's what that lesson covered. Then we moved into the third lesson of these 6 was obedience in building the tabernacle. When we dealt with obedience in building the tabernacle, you will find that it had now been 1 year to the day since they came to the base of Mount Sinai. And in this time period, God had given Moses specific instructions of how the tabernacle was to be built and how they were to gather up things from the people. They were to make cloths and so on and get wood and whatnot, and they were to construct this tabernacle. A year had gone by, and on this day now, Moses and the people now were putting the tabernacle in its proper place among the people of Israel. So that lesson just basically dealt with how they followed the instructions that God had laid out. After this, we had our fourth lesson, which was that of obedience on the Day of Atonement. If you remember the Day of Atonement, we opened up by asking the question, what is our most sacred day? And Helen gave a great answer by saying that for her, every day is a sacred day. Some say Christmas is a sacred day, which is a good answer. Some said Resurrection Sunday is a sacred day. What was a good answer? But you'll find with that, I always say it this way, individually, we have sacred days, but not collectively. In other words, sometimes this one will say this one will say this day, this one will say that day. But you found the children of Israel, there was not any difference. They all celebrated the Day of Atonement as their most sacred of days. Now, there are truly days where we consider sacred, and there are days that we just celebrate, right? We got a big one coming up. I'm going to skip over Thanksgiving. Let's go to Christmas. For a lot of us, it's a sacred day, right? It's a day that has been set aside, that the Christians say that at one time Christ came into this world, and we celebrate his birth on that day. And it's considered to be a sacred day, whereas many just celebrate it. But there's a difference between being sacred and celebration. But you'll find that we consider it a sacred day itself. But you'll find the Day of Atonement, it was a great day that I would say a burden was lifted off your shoulders. And remember that burden lifted off your shoulders. That plays a role in the upcoming lesson. You'll find that throughout the year, sacrifices was given for the sins of other people. And you'll find that these sacrifices was given because Christ had not come. Because, Christ would come and give how many sacrifices? Just one sacrifice. And that was it, and your sins were all washed away. But until that time, one day out of the year, the high priest could come into the Holy of Holies in the very presence of the Ark of the Covenant, and he had to give a sacrifice for his sins, for his family's sins, and then for the people's sins. And people were truly repentant of the wrong that they had done, and this burden now was lifted off their shoulders, and they called it the Day of Atonement. Their most sacred day, even to this very day, they still celebrate it in that fashion. But then we moved to our fifth lesson, which was obedience in offerings. In that lesson with obedience in offerings, we talked about what are the 3 primary ways we give an offering. Anybody remember what they are? What are the 3 primary ways we give offerings? Nobody remember? Time, talent, and treasures. That's the primary way today we give our offerings. But I also gave you 3 sayings. Remember, I said that these 3 sayings, they are similar. They are saying the same thing, but I said they are different. And you remember I brought up how the first one I said was, what do you bring? Oh, no, I take that back. I said, what do you have to offer? Remember that? And that talked about not what tangibly you brought to the table, but what do you as a person have to offer. It's kind of like when God talks about a cheerful giver. In other words, look at yourself. Look in the mirror. What do you bring to the table? I think one of the analogies I use, like in the sporting world, you'll have on the court, you have on the field, a talented player. They have a lot to offer. But yet, players will say, we don't want him in the locker room, though, because of what he has to offer. In other words, when they look at the person, they don't want to deal with that. But God cares more about the person than he does the offering. The second one I gave you was the tangible part. What do you bring to the table? When it comes to the offering, what do you bring? Is it something that God would be pleased with? Are you bringing your best, or are you bringing your least? And then the last one we talked about is of what value is your offering. What do you mean by what value of offering? Just to give an offering is not enough. I'll give you a weak example here. That's like saying that we're going to have a celebration in the back, right? And we ask everybody to bring something. And digging bush, somebody brings a bag of potato chips, all busted up and crunched up. Somebody else brings a big old 2-liter Coke, flat as can be. But you said you bought something. So the point is, what value is your offering? It has to have some value to it. So this was that lesson dealt with when we talk about obedience in offering, that God had for people to bring an offering, but you couldn't just bring anything and offer before God. Then we moved to the last lesson of unit number 2, which was obedience in feasts. And this goes back to that burden that was lifted off your shoulders on the Day of Atonement. This particular feast, which was known at this time, well, the name had changed over the years. First, it was the Feast of Ingathering. Then it was the Feast of Booths. Then it became the Feast of Tabernacles. This feast took place 5 days after the Day of Atonement. And why it played an important role was Day of Atonement was all about getting a burden lifted off your shoulders. So now you truly could celebrate, because this festival known as the Feast of Tabernacles was a festival that they were commanded in the book of Deuteronomy. They were commanded that they had to celebrate. They had to have a good time. It was all about they had to go out for 7 days and live in a tent, live in a booth, as they would call it, live in a tabernacle, or our folks would call it a brush arbor, to remember that at one time you were wanderers in the wilderness and this is how you live, to also cause you to reflect upon how God brought you through to bring you to where you are today and how he sustained you. So it kind of makes us think about that if we were to do that for 7 days. Go back years ago how we used to live, to remember just how far God has brought us and how much he has blessed us. But this wasn't about living through some hard times. Remember, it's about celebrating. To describe it, I guess I could call it this, Wallace. It would be a 7-day church in the field event. That's how it was set up. Everybody would do it together, build tents, and they would camp out for an entire week. Every day they would celebrate and have a good time. I could show you now, if we had time, in Deuteronomy, where God says he mandated that they are to celebrate, that they are to be joyous and have a great time with it. Because now, guess what? They are free people. So that's what that lesson dealt with when it talks about obedience in feasts. And then all that brings us to where we are now in the last unit, which is obedience in society. And we talk about obedience in society, I use as a backdrop the second tables of the law. In other words, the last 6 of the 10 commandments, which deals with your one-on-one relationship with your fellow man in society. If I have them in the correct order, the 5th one was honor thy mother and thy father. Or was it father and mother? I think Sonia correct me, did you? Was it father and mother? Yep. You honor your parents. The 6th one was thou shalt not kill, or some translation read it more correctly, thou shalt not murder. Then you had the 7th one, which was thou shalt not commit adultery. Not idolatry, but adultery. The 8th one was thou shalt not steal. Then you had thou shalt not bring up a false report against thy neighbor. And then lastly, thou shalt not cover what thy neighbor has. So these deals with your fellow man society. This first lesson that we dealt with was, you remember, obedience in justice. Most teach that lesson from the standpoint of dealing with judicial matters, in court cases and so on from there. But really just dealt with treating people fairly. So you could use that lesson actually to how you would conduct things in the church, in your home, on the job, or just dealing with people. In other words, treating everybody justly. And one of the key things they brought up in there was, it says, thou shalt not raise up, you remember, a false report. And what was a false report? A lie. Remember we talked about sometimes you got to be direct and call a lie a lie. But I want to bring up something right now that I didn't bring up then, but I thought about it, but I didn't bring it up. But it's interesting. one of our students brought it up with me this week, this conversation, and we've had it in here before, but I'm going to ask it again. It says, do not raise up a false report. So that means you don't lie, right? The question I had in here in previous times was this: is it ever right to lie? Are you justified in lying? I hear no. Anybody else? Is it ever a right time to lie? Okay. Let me give you my input. Y'all ready for this? Now, notice what I just said, as always. Sandra always very keen to catch me on that. What did I just say? No. What did I just say? What did I say, okay? This is just me. This is my opinion, okay? Now, let me be very careful what I'm saying. I'm going to talk not on both sides of my mouth, even though you might see me as doing that, but I'm not. But I also want to be very careful. Don't nobody leave here, especially Sister Henry. I want you to leave here and say, guess what? I went to Brown Grove Sunday School, and I told Diggin many times, I love coming to your Sunday school, but I ain't never been to a church where Diggin and the chairman of the board says it's all right to lie. Because there are times where you can't lie. Y'all shocked I said that? Let me speak on this. It's one thing to tell a lie. It's another thing to practice lying. And there's a difference. Sometimes a lie may be convenient because of the greater good. And what I mean by that is, once again, this is me, right? Let's say somebody's been involved, older couple has been involved now in a horrific car accident. The husband has now succumbed to his injuries. He died. The elderly wife, her body now is weak from the trauma of the accident. Her spirit now is weak because of all that has gone on. And she asked me, how's her husband? I may have to look her straight in the eye and say, your husband's doing fine. Now, I told a lie, right? She goes to the hospital, okay? A few days later, her body's stronger, right? Her spirit now is stronger. She realizes and knows now that her husband has died. Guess who now come to visit her? Here comes Kenny. And she basically tells me, you lied to me. Why did you lie and tell me my husband was all right when you know he had died? My honest response would be, I lied to you out of love. I knew your husband had died. Looking at the situation you were in, if I had told you he had died, my fear is that you would succumb to your injuries and you would have died also. Easily I could have told you that, but I couldn't live with that, and I did not want your demise to come because of the words I've said. But in respect, truly, as you know right now, he is doing fine, doing better than all of us. But out of love, I told you that lie, that prayerfully you would live. And I ask now that you forgive me for telling you that lie. But I felt justified in it because of the greater good. It's no different than someone comes to that door right now looking for the pastor to do him some harm. They say, where Pastor Beecher, man? I'm saying, he's not here. I lied. I don't practice lying, but I told a lie at that moment because of the greater good. And one supporting thing that I've always used in this situation is that, if you remember, years later after Joseph had died, the children of Israel, or the Hebrews, multiplied in great numbers, to the point that the Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, said, if these people join our enemies, they can easily overthrow us. So tell the midwives, the mandate from the king is that when a Hebrew woman has a male child, you are to drown that child in the Jordan River. But if she has a daughter, allow the child to live. The word says that the midwives feared God, which means they honored God, they respected God, they believed in God. Didn't do this, but actually had brought the child into the world, and the parents went on. As the people continued to multiply, it says, then Pharaoh confronted the midwives, so what is this you have done? Did not I give a command to drown the male child in the river? And their words was, Pharaoh, the midwives, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. By the time we get there, they already had the child and gone. We just couldn't keep up with them. And then the word says immediately after that, these words, and the Lord blessed them and gave them homes for the good deeds they had done. In other words, I'm saying you don't practice lying, but sometimes the lie might be for the greater good at that particular moment. Here you'll find in the word, they lied, and God blessed them for it. And don't leave here, start lying and say, oh, I'm going to get some blessing today. I'm not saying that. But the question once again was, is it ever right to lie? Sometimes for the greater good, it may be what you have to say. But there's a big problem when you practice lying. That goes back to what we talked about last week. When somebody practices so much, you say, if their mouth moving, you know they're lying. Mm-hmm. Dick Bush? Out of love. He's doing better now. Mm-hmm. He was doing better then, but she wasn't ready for that at that time. Right. Mm-hmm. 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 You could say it technically, but I didn't want to seem like I was talking out of both sides of my mouth. You know what I mean? You follow me? Yeah. Yeah. But in her eyes, you told me a lie. I asked you, how's he doing? You said, all right, which I knew what she was talking about. But you try to ease things over. Sometimes, like I say, it comes to the greater good. Are you doing more harm or are you doing more good by your words that are giving? But the key part is this: God knows your heart. Those midwives who did not heed Pharaoh's command and told him a lie, God knew their hearts. Because remember, the word said this: they feared the Lord. So they obeyed God rather than that of man. But that's all in dealing with what? How we deal with our fellow folks in society. It all still follows the theme of our lesson, which brings us to the next lesson. After that was obedience in rest. Remember, this lesson dealt last week with the commandment to take a rest on that of the seventh day. But it was more than just take a rest on the seventh day. It was all about honoring the Sabbath day because of what God had did in the order of creation, and also for them to reflect back upon how when they were in Egyptian bondage, they never got a day of rest. But here God says to sanctify this day. What do you say? He says, this day is a holy day that he may sanctify you. In other words, it sets you apart. Because God, people are always called to be what from everybody else? Separate, different. You're supposed to stand out as a sign. Remember last week we played the country music? Then we played an R&B song. We played a gospel, and immediately you knew what each one was? That's how God's people should be. You automatically know a person of God immediately. But that was the old lesson. But now all that brings us to the lesson that we have today, which dealt with obedience among neighbors. Anybody read this lesson? Anybody studied this lesson? I hear crickets up in here. It's a pretty easy lesson to follow along with. It dealt with obedience among neighbors. Really, it's dealing with treating your neighbor justly, treating your neighbor fairly, doing that which is right, still following that same theme of obedience in society. And you'll find that it all falls under this thing we call the golden rule. Anybody remember what Deacon Hayes would say with the golden rule? He said, a guy once told him, you don't remember those wise words? Deacon Hayes said, the golden rule, the man told him one time, do it to them before you do it to you. And we know that's a twist of it. You know, Linda has one, said, what's the golden rule? She said, she was always told, those have all the gold, make all the rules. So that's the golden rule. Anybody with all the gold, mix all the rules. But you'll find that that's man's concept. That's not God's concept. It is totally different. If you want to even look it up in Matthew 7 and 12, we have the breakdown of what we call the golden rule. It says, therefore, all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do you even so to them, for this is a law and the prophets. If you notice it said, whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do you even so to them. Basically, how do you want somebody to treat you? You want people to lie to you? You want people to defraud you? You want people to steal from you? Because this is what that lesson deals with. No, you don't. But what he talks about is, as you want somebody to treat you, you should do the exact same thing. And everybody wants nothing but what's good and what's right and what's just for yourself. So therefore, you have that same concept, yet even with others. But you'll find that, unfortunately, there are many people that are abused by this, and typically it is the poor. Because even later on in Matthew, Jesus says in Matthew 26:11, "For ye have the poor always with you." He said, always with you, but me you have not always. In other words, the poor will always be with you. And those are what we call your neighbors. And you'll find that the question comes up, what is a neighbor? I'm going to give it to you very quickly if you want to follow along. What is a neighbor? In Luke 10, I'm sorry, but maybe verse 25, this tells the story. This deals with the story of how this lawyer tempted him to tempt Jesus. Although he asked a question, but he asked it for an ulterior motive. He basically asks a question, and Jesus explained to him who the neighbor is and who's in need. He starts off by saying in 10:25 of Luke, "And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "What is written in the law? And how readest thou?" He says, then answer him, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself." Jesus said, "You answered correctly." But he, willing to justify himself, said unto Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" So then Jesus goes in the story, you know how this certain man left Jerusalem, went down to Jericho. You remember the thieves jumped on him and beat him up and robbed him. It said first a priest came by, looked at him and kept going, or went to the other side of the road. A Levite came, did the exact same thing. Then a Samaritan came and bandaged up his wounds and so on from there. In other words, did him nothing but good. But he goes on to say, oops, let me back up. If I can find it, then and I move my page too far. But in the end, you'll find that Jesus then says to him, "Which now of these three thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell upon thieves?" And he said, "He that showed mercy on him." Then Jesus said unto him, "Go and do thou likewise." So his neighbor is that one that is truly in need, and you're to treat them justly and fairly. But when it comes to those who are, we can use a term said less fortunate, or those that are poor, how are they treated today? Are they treated fairly? Are they treated justly? Are they looked out for? What do you think? Are they treated fairly? I once seen a homeless person on the street a long time ago, and they had a dog was over, I guess it was their dog, was beside him. A person stepped over the homeless person and fed the dog. Rough, isn't it? How are people treated today? Those who are less fortunate. I'll give you a political viewpoint. Everybody knows what's going on in Ukraine, right? The war and whatnot going on. I sit there and shook my head as I watched this week. One of the Republicans was talking about one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to stop this aid going to the Ukraine. He said, because we are spending too much money helping out Ukraine when Germany and the rest of them aren't doing their share as being part of NATO. So we're going to cut our money. My response to that was, you're partly correct, because most of the other countries don't do financially as they're supposed to do. Even though they say they're going to do this, the United States usually does the most. In a certain respect, we should. We consider ourselves the most powerful nation. We consider ourselves the richest nation. We're the only nation to have military bases in everybody's country and try to influence their political government and so on. So you have to take that leadership role and step up. And that's what you should do. But I look beyond that, because here's what I saw, Sandra. They were talking about all the men in Ukraine was killed. And the man said, well, how much money is this costing us? They brought up about the women that were killed and raped. How much is this going to cost us? They talked about the kids being orphans and even children killed. They said these words, how much is this going to cost us? They talked about the people that were, you see the news with their hands behind their back, laying in the street. They had gunshots to the head where they just murdered in the street. And they said, how much is this going to cost us? They showed all the buildings that were blown up. I mean, nice homes, the malls. And it always came back to this. How much is this going to cost us? Country, people with all the money want to always keep all the money. But those that are less fortunate, and you have the ability to help them out, why not help them out? There's an old saying, if God has blessed you, you're supposed to do what? Bless somebody else. And this is how this lesson, for me, starts out. In our first two verses, it deals with, it says, and when you reap the harvest of your land, Thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And when thou shalt not glean thy vineyards, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. What we have here is, let me say real estate. Is real estate of great value? Real estate is a valuable commodity. I heard one real estate person say that's the only thing that God is not recreating, and that's land. When he made it, that was it. It may change hands, but there's no new land popping up. And it has great value. Great value that you'll find that when farmers farm land, they will use every square foot of their acreage to bring forth maximum profit for themselves, which is a smart thing to do, isn't it? Extremely smart to do. You take every inch, every square foot of that acreage to bring back for yourself maximum profit. You find the biblical times you had a similar circumstance, but a little bit different. You'll find that land for them was extremely valuable because it pretty much was agricultural. Everything they did mostly. You had to have land to raise crops to feed your family. You had to have land to raise your animals. You had to have land to make crops to sell for the market. You had to have land to build your houses on. So they would use the land, shall we say, to make the maximum profit, but not solely for themselves. Y'all see the play on words there? Today, they maximum profit for themselves. God's people would make profit, but not solely for themselves, also for others, because they themselves were blessed in this. When they would time to get the harvest, they were mandated here with the grapes, the trees, the fields. In the fields, gather up the crops. But on the edges, on the sides, and at the roads, you leave it there for the poor and for the strangers. Now, let me tell you what I mean by for the poor and the stranger. You have to look really at Deuteronomy. And there's a purpose why you look at Deuteronomy. Even though this writing is in the book of Leviticus, Leviticus means the law of the priest, okay? Deuteronomy goes in greater details on what this law means. For example, Deuteronomy was talking about leaving it by the roadway. And why you left by the roadway? Let me give you an example. When we travel today, and we're going on a trip, right? We're going to Florida, we're driving, and you get hungry, what do? Get something to eat. Where? You stop at a cornfield and what they left on the side of the road? You typically riding down the road and you do like this. Where's the nearest Cracker Barrel? Where's the nigger's Sheets? Where's such place at? Because you can stop and get something because you are a stranger. You know where nothing's at. You're driving, just try to find something. And they don't have no Cracker Barrels. They don't have any Wawas or Sheets. So they had to rely on the hospitality of others in their travels before they get to a city. Oh, here's a field. And the food that was left on the side was for the stranger. Now, mind you, even though it was left there for the stranger, for the poor, you weren't supposed to come there and start making groceries. You get enough just to sustain yourself. Deuteronomy even goes on to say when they're gathering up the corn and their sheaves and all, if you were to leave one, you can't come back and get it. If you dropped one, you couldn't pick it up because it was left there for those who were poor and those who were traveling. And if those who were traveling, they couldn't come there with sickles and cut more of it. Like, no, you just take what's left here. Now, what they received was they had to get it themselves. In other words, you had to work for it. So in the end, God had blessed you. You're supposed to now bless somebody else by allowing them to eat of that. Now, why does Deuteronomy say all this and Leviticus doesn't? Well, once again, Leviticus means the law of the priests. Deuteronomy, by definition, means the repetition of the law or the second law. Now, when you say repetition means you're doing what? You're repeating it. So if you repeat something, you're doing it how many times? At least twice. So that's why they call it the repetition of the law or the second law. What Deuteronomy does is it repeats everything Leviticus has said, but sometimes it goes into greater detail. It's like in Genesis when you have the story of creation. The first chapter tells you a hierarchy of how things happen. The second chapter kind of goes more into details of all that took place. But Deuteronomy just basically gives you more details of how things were to go about. Because when you say just leave the edges of the field, that was it. It's like, no, you leave it for the poor. And this is what they are to do. They only gather enough they can eat that day. They are not to come there and get bags and get tons of food. It's left there to help each one Each individual out, especially that of the stranger. So it's basically showing me here is you have this whole field for yourself. God has blessed you. You're taking in a great harvest. But just like I bless you, you need to bless someone else, especially those who are less fortunate. Because the poor are the ones people typically would take advantage of. And this is why the first two verses has dealt with that. It dealt with your compassion and that of sharing. And now we move on to more of conduct. It says in verse 11, let me read back through both and get the understanding of it. The beginning verse says again, and when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest, and thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of the vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. I am the Lord your God. 11 says, ye shall not steal, neither deal falsely, neither lie one to another. Dealing with your fellow man. And the first thing it says is, ye shall not what? Steal. Typically, you'll find most of these things happen to those who are less fortunate. People will take advantage of them. You look in society today, if you do background checks of many people or many of the great families that became filthy rich, you know how they got their money? Through deception, through stealing, through that of lying. And that's a true statement. You look at some of these old families with their, what we call it, that old money. Oftentimes they got it through deceptive ways. But God says, ye shall not steal. God didn't ask you this. He said, no stealing. But yet you'll find that those who have would often steal from those who do not have. Does a poor community have money? No. It depends. What it depends on? Mm-hmm. When you look at that, typically a poor community doesn't have money individually, but collectively, if they can work together, if they can pool their resources, they can have wealth. I saw a documentary on this one time. They talked about the drug dealers. Where do drug dealers sell their drugs at? In the corners. Where at though? There you go, to the poor people. They will go to the most poorest community they can find and take advantage of those folks by selling drugs. And how much money they make? Wait a minute, how do they make a ton of money and the people don't have no money? You see my point? They make millions of dollars throughout the week, taking money from the poor, but it's collectively. This is why when you bring your resources together, you'll be amazed at what you can do. You know, you go back in Black history, when we had areas of Richmond and whatnot that was mostly black owned. You remember those days? Those folks did very well, didn't they? Oh, but then when time changed and competition and segregation and so on, split us up. Collectively, a lot of power there, a lot of money. Individually, everybody's, but I got mine, you have yours to get. What's the town that they destroyed? Not in Richmond. What's the town they destroyed? It was like they always call it like Wall Street. I can't remember the name of it. Y'all know what I'm talking about? Yeah, where they just destroyed the businesses, burnt everything down. Didn't want you to have anything. Wanted you to be poor. Wanted you to be downtrodden. They stole everything from you. He said, ye shall not steal, neither deal falsely, neither lie one to another. I'm just going to say that, and that was last week's political campaign. Let's move on. It says, and ye shall not swear by my name falsely, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God, I am the Lord. This goes back to the third commandment here. Taking the Lord's name in vain, but he goes a little bit further. He says here what? Ye shall not swear by my name falsely, neither shalt thou profane name. What do you mean you swear by God's name falsely? What does that mean? I swear by God's name falsely. Well, keep in mind, well, I guess you could say that applies to everybody, but especially to the believer. Because I always say about it in a courtroom setting, when they bring the Bible out and say, put your hand on the Bible, raise your right hand, do you swear to tell the whole truth, so help you God? And most time they say what? They say, I do. And I would say, I would be surprised a whole lot of them not even Christians. You follow me? So you could have a Ebony magazine and put it up there. They'll say the exact same thing because it doesn't mean nothing to them because they don't know God. But as far as God-fearing people, we know better. But we're talking about swearing in God's name falsely. That basically means you made a swear by using God's name and know you're not going to do it. You know how we talk? We don't say for, we say fo. You say, I swear for God that I'm going to do so-and-so, and you know you're not going to do it. I swear on my children by God, and so on. No, you're telling a lie. God said that you don't do that with his name to invoke him being in that. It says, verse 12, ye shall not swear by my name falsely, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord. Thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning. Since we're running out of time, what does that mean, folks? Oh, y'all don't speak up quick on that one. I done did this work, Butch, and you ain't paid me? You supposed to speak up quick. Talking money and finance here, talking about people who have done a job. The job is done. Pay should be made, right? Should be compensated. But what you do, you keep the money. You hold on to the money. They use here a term of you keep it for a night, but it basically means you're holding back what is rightfully given to somebody else. You may give it to them, but maybe at a later date that you might give that money. Mm-hmm. But here it says you don't do that. The fair way to do it, if they worked for it, you're supposed to pay them and pay them fairly. You're not supposed to hold back what is rightfully now thous. 14 said, thou shalt not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but thou shalt fear thy God, I am the Lord. Do people actually take advantage of homeless folks? I'm not homeless folks, handicapped folks? I'm quite sure they do. Taking advantage of folks who are blind, people who are deaf, people who can't walk, just taking advantage of them. We probably go through various ways today, especially a blind one. I remember, I don't know how they do it. You might know how the blind count the money, but some can. I don't know how they do it. They'll take the money, they'll feel it, and they know exactly what they have. I don't know how they do it, but some folks can do that. I don't know if it has a different feel to it or whatever it may be. But if you can't count your money, can't see it, think people going to steal from you? I'm in a movie with Ray Charles that Jimmy Fox played in. Remember the guy was paying him and he was cheating him the whole time, but he caught on to it. People will take advantage of those if they can. And it says, and if a stranger sojourn with thee in your land, you shall not vex him, but the strangers that dwell with you shall be unto you as one born among you, and thou shalt love him as thyself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. You know what it is to be a stranger? God's telling the people, at one time you were a stranger in a strange land, and you didn't want anybody to treat you in a bad way, so don't vex them. The same way, you had to treat them as one of your very own. In other words, when a stranger comes, you be kind, you be nice to that stranger. Why? In the end, because he said these words, I am the Lord your God. After every statement, God made that statement, let you know that I am the one who is saying this, I am the one who's sealing this. Moses is writing this down so people don't get confused by thinking, this is Moses' words. No, this is God's words that is now coming forth. And to close this thing out, it says here, and ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in metayard, in weight, or in measure. This basically talks about in selling of things and trading and so on from there. Or in measure, just balance, just weights, a just ephus, a just hin shall you have. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall you observe all my statutes and all my judges and do them. I am the Lord. Basically deals in the marketplace. Don't be deceptive. Treat people fairly. But is the market cheating people nowadays? In many ways. I watched a report where they showed they'll have 2 jars of peanut butter. They look the same. But then you look at the bottom, this one at the bottom here has a raised bottom. So it's like hollow at the bottom, then it comes up. So it looks the same, but actually it holds a lot less. Went to buy a box of cereal. It was like $3.89 for the cereal. But when I looked at the box used to be this wide, then the box this wide. But it's the same height as the other one. But I didn't catch on to it. I'm like, wait a minute, I bought the wrong box. They're selling for the same price as this one, but you can see it's a thin box, but it's just as tall. They try to make it look the same as others. So there's many ways that things like this happen. Deacon Bush will close this thing out. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I tell you one that I don't know how well you guys, mainly you guys, not being sexist women, but many of you guys know how much gas goes in your car, right? I'm a gallon man. I don't look at the price a lot. Well, I do. But what I mean is I look at the gallons, how much gallons gas went into the car. I've had this 94 Civic of mine I drive to work all the time. I know every time when that thing gets about on E, all they're going to take water is 9 gallons. I don't care where I go, 9 gallons every single time. But for some reason, whenever I go to the sheets up here at the end of the ash cake, it always takes 12 gallons. Measure your car one day and go there and try it. And this has happened on multiple occasions. I said, I know this car only takes 9 gallons. Because I'm a penny pincher. I'm going, how much gas cost me today? Red day, $3.59. Okay, this is going to cost me such dollars. I'm pumping. I hit that 9 gallon mark, Ms. Henry, and cling, 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 cling. I'm like, the world, the thing going to stop? Kind of makes you wonder. Hmm? Oh, I believe it has air in it. Because this one up here gets me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or you get that one, folks, where you hit the trigger and 5 cents go by and nothing comes out yet. You're like, wait a minute, is gas pumping yet? That sounds minor, doesn't it? But imagine you have 400 or 500 calls a day coming through. That money adds up. We got to watch the marketplace. It can be deceptive. Oh, before we close out, since everybody's pretty much here, Wallace, you mind? I had the books a little bit earlier this time. So here are your Sunday school books now. We're not in them yet. We still got another lesson to go. Another lesson to go before we get into those books. And then once you pass those out, we have a word of prayer and we'll close things out. But our lesson for next week deals with obedience and celebration. Now, this lesson of obedience and celebration, the title is misleading to a certain degree. I guess you can call it celebrating, but really it deals with what's called the year of Jubilee, which is very important to study here. You remember back when we talked about Naboth, the guy that had a vineyard that King Ahab wanted? And we're talking about Jezebel, she had the man murdered. And he said, I can't give you my inheritance. It goes back to this next week lesson, which deals with the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee deals with economically, God makes sure everybody's on somewhat of the same plane. In other words, any land that you may have sold, any debt you may have had, everything started over after the 50-year period. Now, that doesn't mean that you didn't try to pay your debt. Like, I'm going to wait this thing out. No, you made every attempt to pay off that debt. But in the end, at that 50-year period, you started back again brand new. Because people often get in, financial trouble and debt, and they could never get out of it. This was a way for everybody always to get out of a debt situation, you could say, and start over again. But the land would always remain in your family as an inheritance, as they would call it. Mm-hmm. So that gives you somewhat of an overview of what next week's lesson about. Like I said, they don't use the title, but it's really called the year of Jubilee, which happened every 50 years. You would basically start all over again. If you lost land or had to sell land, you would obtain it back in your family, and you go on from there. So that would always be your inheritance. So this is one of the reasons why Naboth tells King Ahab, I can't give you my inheritance, because it was law that he couldn't give it to him. Mm-hmm. So with those words being said, I think everybody has a book for right now. With that being said, the time is at hand for us to rise to our feet, and may we rise to our feet. And Deacon Hall, if you don't mind, give us a closing word of prayer.